I have pulled 37 bodies out of the deep woods in my 3 decades as a boundary tracker. But the most terrifying thing I ever found wasn't a corpse. It was a man who had been legally dead for 4 years, sitting perfectly still by a smokeless fire, waiting for the person who killed him. Welcome to the unseen wilderness. I want to tell you a story that never made the local news. It's a case file that was quietly shredded by the county sheriff. A secret buried so deep in the remote valleys of the Black Hills that only 3 living people know the truth. And after tonight, I suppose you will be the 4th. There is a line where the paved roads end, where the cell towers lose their reach, and where the laws of civilized men simply stop applying. As a tracker for the Reservation Border Patrol, my job was to walk that line. We search for the lost, the wandering, and the foolish. We deal with the aftermath of what the internet likes to call missing 411 cases. You hear the stories, people vanishing without a single footprint, tracking dogs sitting down in the dirt and refusing to take a scent, sudden, unnatural weather rolling in to wash away any evidence that a human being was ever there. Most people think these disappearances are the result of clumsy accidents, sudden rockfalls, or animal attacks. Some folks whisper about ancient things that mimic human voices. Things the tribal elders have warned us about for centuries. I know those things are real. I have heard them in the dark, but the longest shadows in the forest are usually cast by human beings. 4 years ago, we had a high-profile disappearance. 2 brothers, Arthur and Thomas Sterling, went on a week-long backcountry hunting trip deep in a restricted, unmapped section of the Western Ridge. They were wealthy, heirs to a massive regional logistics empire. They had the best gear money could buy, but money does not buy survival instincts. On the 4th day of their trip, a freak blizzard hit the ridge unseasonably early. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours, according to Arthur. He and Thomas got separated in the whiteout while trying to navigate down a steep shale embankment. Arthur claimed he made it to their emergency rally point and waited for 2 days. Thomas never showed up. Arthur eventually hiked out alone, frostbitten, exhausted, and weeping. He played the grieving brother perfectly. He funded a massive volunteer search effort. He stood in front of the news cameras with tears freezing on his cheeks, begging anyone with information to come forward. I was the lead tracker on that search. For 3 weeks, we combed every inch of that canyon. I pushed my team to the absolute brink. I hated leaving people behind. It's a weight you carry in your chest every time you close your eyes. But the woods were completely silent. We found absolutely nothing. No dropped gear, no disturbed moss, no blood trail. It was as if the mountain had simply opened its jaws and swallowed Thomas Sterling whole. Eventually, the snow grew too deep. The search was officially called off. Thomas was presumed dead. The years moved on. Arthur inherited the entirety of the family empire. He expanded the business, doubled his wealth, and became a prominent local figure. Everyone moved on. Everyone except me. Then 2 months ago, Arthur Sterling showed up at my cabin. He looked terrible. Despite his expensive coat and the luxury truck parked in my driveway, the man looked like he hadn't slept in a year. His eyes were bloodshot, constantly darting around the tree line. His hands shook when he held his coffee. He told me he was putting together a private, unrecorded expedition. He wanted to go back to the exact valley where Thomas disappeared. I told him it was a fool's errand. After 4 years, the scavengers and the seasons would have scattered whatever remained of his brother. There was nothing left to find. But Arthur wasn't looking for a skeleton to bury. He leaned across my table, his voice dropping to a desperate, trembling whisper. He told me that for the last 6 months, he had been finding things in his home. It started with a perfectly carved piece of pine bark sitting on his kitchen counter. Then, he found a bundle of dried sage and raven feathers tied with a specific knot resting on his pillow. Last week, he woke up in the dead of night to the sound of someone walking on his gravel driveway. When he looked out the window, he saw a tall, gaunt silhouette standing perfectly still under the street lamp, staring up at his bedroom. When the motion sensor lights flicked on, the figure was gone. Arthur was convinced that someone was playing a sick psychological game with him. He believed a rival company had found Thomas's journal out in the woods and was using the tragic details to extort him. He needed to go back to the valley. He needed to find the exact spot where he last saw Thomas, to find the abandoned camp, and to prove to himself that his brother was truly gone. He offered me a staggering amount of money to guide him. I didn't take the job for the money. I took it because my instincts were screaming that Arthur was lying to me. The sheer naked terror in his eyes wasn't the fear of a corporate rival. It was the fear of a guilty conscience. And I still carried the guilt of failing to find Thomas 4 years ago. If there was a chance to finally close the book on this case, I had to take it. We set out 3 days later. It was late autumn, that bitter, colorless time of year when the trees are bare and the wind sounds like snapping bone. We hiked for 2 days, pushing 12 miles deep into the restricted boundary lands. The further we went, the more Arthur's civilized veneer began to peel away. He was paranoid. He jumped at the sound of cracking branches. He constantly checked over his shoulder. At night, he insisted we build massive fires. Despite the risk of drawing unwanted attention from the local predators. When he finally managed to sleep, he suffered from violent night terrors. I would sit awake, feeding the fire, listening to the wealthy executive thrash in his sleeping bag, whispering apologies to the dark. On the morning of the 3rd day, the atmosphere in the woods shifted. If you have spent enough time in the deep wilderness, you know exactly what I am talking about. The forest has a baseline frequency. The chatter of squirrels, the rustle of wind, the distant call of crows. But sometimes, usually right before something terrible happens, the woods simply turn off. The air becomes heavy. The silence rings in your ears like a physical pressure. You realize you are no longer the observer. You are being observed. I noticed the first sign around noon. We were navigating through a dense patch of ancient hemlocks when I saw a snapped twig at shoulder height. It wasn't broken by an animal pushing through the brush. It was twisted and snapped deliberately, hanging by a thread of bark. A trail marker. I knelt down and examined the soil. The frost was hard, but I found an impression. It was faint but unmistakable. A footprint, but it wasn't the heavy, treaded imprint of a hiking boot. It was the print of a bare human foot. The toes were splayed wide, the skin clearly calloused enough to leave a sharp edge in the frozen mud. I didn't tell Arthur. I knew he would panic, and a panicking man in the deep woods is a dead man. I kept my head down and quietly began tracking the tracker. By late afternoon, the signs became impossible to ignore. I found a snare trap suspended over a rabbit run. It wasn't made of synthetic paracord or wire. It was braided from thin, wet strips of inner pine bark, woven with terrifying precision. A few miles later, I found a deer carcass hanging high in the branches of an oak tree, completely drained of blood. The meat carved away with expert surgical strikes. Whoever was out here wasn't just surviving, they had adapted. They had become a part of the brutal ecosystem. They had stripped away thousands of years of human evolution and reverted to something ancient, feral, and perfectly efficient. The sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the canyon. We reached the base of the shale embankment where Arthur claimed he had lost his brother. The temperature plummeted. I told Arthur we needed to make camp immediately. He was shivering violently, his eyes darting wildly across the jagged rocks. "We shouldn't be here," Arthur muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "This was a mistake. We need to leave. We need to hike back right now. We can't navigate this terrain in the dark," I told him calmly, dropping my pack. "We set up camp, we keep the fire hot. We leave at first light." He didn't argue. He just sat on a log, wrapping his arms around himself, staring blankly at the tree line. I built the fire. The flames chewed through the dry deadwood, casting a flickering, orange sphere of safety around us. Beyond that light, the darkness was absolute. I sat across from Arthur, resting my hand near the heavy hunting revolver strapped to my chest. "Arthur," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "you need to tell me the truth, right now. Because we are not alone out here. His head snapped up. His face was entirely devoid of color. What do you mean? I mean we have been shadowed for the last 10 miles. I mean there are bare footprints in the frost. Someone is walking these woods, and they are watching us right now. Arthur let out a choked, ragged gasp. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving. The dam finally broke. The guilt, the terror, the isolation of the woods, it all came pouring out of him. It wasn't an accident, Arthur sobbed, his voice cracking. The storm 4 years ago, it wasn't an accident, the company. Our father left the controlling shares to Thomas. Thomas was going to sell it. He wanted to dismantle our legacy and give the money away to charity. I couldn't let him do it. I spent my whole life building that empire with my bare hands. I sat perfectly still. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the world. We were up on the ridge, Arthur continued, crying freely now. The storm hit. Thomas slipped on the shale. He broke his leg. It was a bad break, bone piercing the skin. He couldn't walk. He was begging me to trigger the emergency beacon. Arthur looked up at me, his eyes wide, pleading for a forgiveness I could not give him. I took the beacon, Arthur whispered. I took his heavy winter coat. I took his boots. I told him I was going to find a better signal, and I just walked away. I left him in the snow. I heard him screaming my name for almost a mile. I just kept walking. I knew the storm would bury him. I knew the cold would stop his heart before midnight. The confession hung in the freezing air, toxic and heavy. My stomach turned to lead. I had spent 3 weeks risking my life, risking my team's lives, looking for a man who had been murdered by his own flesh and blood, before I could speak, before I could even process the absolute depravity of what Arthur had done. A voice drifted out of the darkness. You didn't take my compass, Arthur. The voice was raspy, dry, and entirely devoid of human warmth. It sounded like 2 stones grinding together. Arthur screamed. He scrambled backward over the log, landing hard in the dirt, kicking his legs, trying to get away from the sound. I stood up slowly, drawing my revolver, my heart hammering against my ribs. I aimed the barrel into the impenetrable wall of black trees. Who's out there? I demanded, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. Put the gun down, tracker, the voice replied from the shadows. You spent 3 weeks looking for me. You froze your hands, digging through the snowbanks, trying to bring me home. You are the only decent man left in this valley. I will not harm you. From the darkness just beyond the firelight, a figure emerged. He didn't walk into the light. It was more like the shadows simply decided to let him go. He stepped into the orange glow of the fire, and my breath caught in my throat. It was Thomas Sterling. But it wasn't the handsome, wealthy executive from the missing posters. The man standing before us was a ghost made of muscle and scar tissue. He wore garments stitched together from tanned deer hide and thick wolf fur. His face was weathered, burned by the sun and frozen by the winters, turning his skin into tough, leathery parchment. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. A jagged, terrible scar ran down his shin where the bone had broken years ago. He stood barefoot on the freezing earth, seemingly immune to the cold. But it was his eyes that terrified me the most. They weren't the eyes of a madman. They weren't the eyes of a feral beast. They were entirely lucid, sharp, and burning with a cold, calculating intelligence. Arthur was sobbing hysterically on the ground, pressing his back against a boulder. His hands raised as if trying to ward off a demon. Thomas, please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Thomas looked down at his brother with an expression of profound, chilling indifference. You should have made sure I was dead, Arthur, Thomas said quietly. How? I whispered, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. How did you survive the first night? The temperature dropped to 20 below. Thomas slowly turned his eyes to me. There is a network of thermal vents in the caves beneath the eastern ridge, he explained, his voice steady. The local tribes knew about them. I crawled for 6 miles on a shattered leg. I dragged myself through the snow until my fingernails tore off. I found a vent. I laid in the dark, in the heat of the earth, for 4 months. I ate blind cave spiders. I ate roots. I set my own leg with rocks and stripped vines. He paused, looking back at Arthur. The pain should have killed me, Thomas continued. The infection should have killed me. But every time my heart started to slow down. Every time the darkness tried to pull me under, I thought about my brother. I thought about him sitting in a warm house, drinking expensive scotch, wearing my coat. My hatred was a physical thing. It burned hotter than the thermal vents. It kept me alive. It burned away everything soft, everything weak, everything human about me. Thomas took a step closer to the fire. He moved with a terrifying grace, completely silent, rolling his weight on the outsides of his feet like an apex predator. When the spring came, Thomas said, I realized I couldn't go back. If I walked out of these woods, I would just be a victim. I would have to hire lawyers. I would have to fight Arthur in court. I would be dragged back into a world of contracts and lies. The woods taught me a simpler truth. Out here, there is no negotiation. There is only survival, and there is only consequence. Arthur fell to his knees, pressing his forehead into the dirt. Take the company, he begged, weeping uncontrollably. Take all the money, take the houses. I'll sign it all over to you. Just let me live, Thomas. Please let me live. Thomas stared down at his brother. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. I don't want the company, Arthur, Thomas said softly. I don't want the money. I brought you back out here for a very specific reason. Thomas reached into his fur coat and pulled out a heavy, blood-stained winter jacket. It was the exact same coat Arthur had stolen from him 4 years ago. Thomas threw it onto the dirt in front of the fire. Then he dropped a pair of heavy winter boots beside it. I have been to your house, Arthur, Thomas said. I could have killed you in your sleep 12 times over the last 6 months. But that wouldn't be justice. That would just be murder. Thomas looked up at me. Tracker. Pack your gear. You are walking out of here tonight. I gripped my revolver, my mind racing. I can't leave him here, Thomas. He committed a crime. He needs to stand trial. Let me take him back. Let me arrest him. Thomas shook his head slowly. The laws of the town do not apply past the tree line. You know that better than anyone. He committed a crime against the forest. He brought greed and betrayal into a place that demands absolute honesty. The forest will judge him. Thomas took a step toward me. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the man made me take a step back. You tried to save me, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding rumble. You honored your duty. Now honor my survival. Walk away. If you raise that gun, I will kill you before your finger pulls the trigger. And you know I can. I looked at Thomas. I looked at the terrifying, unnatural stillness of his posture. I knew he was telling the truth. He was no longer a man. He was a manifestation of the wilderness itself. If I fought him, I would die. I looked at Arthur, groveling in the dirt, a pathetic, treacherous coward who had left his own blood to freeze for a better bank account. I slowly holstered my weapon. I picked up my pack. No. Arthur screamed, scrambling toward me, grabbing my pant leg. You can't leave me. You're a ranger. It's your job to protect me. I looked down at Arthur, feeling nothing but a profound, icy disgust. My job is to find the missing, I said quietly. I found him. I kicked my leg free from Arthur's grasp. I turned my back to the fire and began walking into the dark tree line. Take off your coat, Arthur, I heard Thomas say behind me. The sound of his voice sent a violent shiver down my spine. Take off your boots, Thomas. No, please, it's freezing. I know, Thomas replied. Start walking. I didn't look back. I hiked through the darkness for 6 hours, guided only by the moonlight and the compass in my hand. I didn't stop until the sun crested over the eastern ridge, bleeding pale morning, light into the canyon. By the time I reached my truck at the border station, a heavy, gray snow had begun to fall, covering my tracks, burying the secrets of the valley under a fresh blanket of white. I resigned from the border patrol the next morning. I packed up my cabin, drove 3 states away, and never looked back. A month later, I saw a small article in a regional newspaper. Arthur Sterling, wealthy CEO, had gone missing during a solo hiking trip in the Bitterroot Mountains. A massive search effort had been launched, but due to severe weather, the search was called off. He was presumed dead. I never told the sheriff. I never told the news. I kept the secret because I know the truth about the deep woods. The wilderness is not evil and it is not good. It is simply a mirror. It strips away your money, your titles, and your lies, and it forces you to face exactly what you are. Arthur Sterling was a parasite, and the woods dealt with him the way nature always deals with sickness. And Thomas. Sometimes when the winter winds howl around my new home, I think about him out there. A phantom walking barefoot through the freezing snow, a guardian of the deep timber, ensuring that the ancient rules of the forest are respected. There are places in this country where you are never truly alone. Where the trees have eyes and the shadows have memories, the woods are calling. But if you value your life, you shouldn't answer.